What does racism in Russia actually look like? It doesn't follow Western rules. It follows its own. I'm Elvira Bary. I grew up in Soviet Russia, and in today's video, I'll show you how racism takes shape in a country where over 100 ethnicities live, often blending together through generations of mixed marriages. Yet being white is still seen as the norm. Let's rewind. Strict internal movement controls, limited international trade in the Russian Empire, and later, the almost total isolation of the Soviet era meant that most Russians had never met a single foreigner. I was born and raised in the city of Gorky, now called Nizhny Novgorod, which was close to foreigners because of its many military factories. When I was growing up, I only saw people of other races on television. In the early 1980s, it was common to see African leaders or ambassadors appear on Soviet Central TV. They looked impressive in their bright traditional outfits, but they never said anything interesting. They just read scripted speeches about the unbreakable friendship between their nations and the Soviet people. We kids sat there politely, just waiting for the speech to end, because after that, it was movie time. We didn't even realize how wrapped our perception of black people was. To us Soviet children, they were cartoon characters, literally. I remember having a doll when I was about 6 or 7 and looked like this. I loved the doll. He was one of my favorites. But back then, none of us had the slightest idea that it was completely wrong to depict people this way. At the same time, Soviet propaganda never missed a chance to condemn the United States for racism and segregation. We were told that only in the Soviet Union could black people live as true equals. I still remember one story from my elementary school textbook about a girl named Nancy. She and her mother went to buy new shoes, but when she tried them on, they were too tight. The racist salesman said her mother had to buy them anyway, because no one would want shoes that a black girl had touched. Nancy started crying. Then a kind man in work clothes stepped in, bought the shoes, and everyone clapped. The end. Stories like that left no doubt. America was cruel and unjust. We read dozens of tales like this, and of course the authors had never been to America. They just wrote what the government wanted to be written. This is a first, for me and for this channel. Until now, I've never taken on sponsors. But when private internet access VPN reached out, I said yes, and here's why. Browsing without a VPN is like whispering state secrets in a crowded cafe. You think no one's listening? They are. I talk a lot about censorship and fear in Russia, but you don't need to live in a dictatorship to have your online life tracked, stored, or sold. Your data is exposed on public Wi-Fi, on your phone, even at home. Private internet access hides your IP and encrypts your traffic. It shields your digital life on every device you own. Think you've got nothing to hide? That's exactly what they are counting on. And here's something I genuinely love. PIE lets you access region-locked content in 91 countries. As a huge fan of British nature documentaries, I can finally watch titles like Earth and Big Cats, which aren't even available in the US, by simply switching my location to the United Kingdom. No logging, no limits, just freedom. Right now you can get 83% off by using my link, pivpn.com/Elvira Bary. It's just $2.03 a month plus 4 extra months free. Use my link below to sign up. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. You deserve the same protection the powerful take for granted. Thanks for being here. And now back to the video. It wasn't until the early 1990s that I saw a person of a different race for the very first time. I was riding a tram, and a group of Indian students got on. probably there to study medicine at one of our local universities. The entire tram went silent. People just stared. We were stunned. Years later, my husband and I traveled to China, and the moment we stepped onto the street in a small, non touristy town, the entire crowd turned to stare at us. I think I finally understood how those Indian students must have felt. It's the kind of moment you never forget. Instead of traditional racism, Russia developed something else: xenophobia. It targeted groups that stood out ethnically or culturally: Roma people, Jews, people from the Caucasus, or later migrants from Central Asia. I have a separate video about that. Check it out if you're curious. The links are in the description. Both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union claimed to be families of nations. Under that source, different ethnic groups were expected to be grateful subjects of the Russian crown. Under the Soviets, the ideology shifted to internationalism. In theory, race didn't matter. Only your loyalty to the working class did. In practice, Russia's history is full of strange and telling stories about race and racism. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. But sometimes the story takes a strange turn. In the Russian Empire, black people were so rare that they were seen less as individuals and more as living curiosities, symbols of wealth, power, and cosmopolitan flair. Having a black servant or attendant in your household wasn't just a status symbol. It was a statement. Look how far my reach extends. Look what I can afford. This bizarre fashion reached its height in the 18th century. But one man's story would turn this odd custom into something far more meaningful. His name was Abram Petrovich Gannibal. According to legend, he was born around 1696, probably in what is now Cameroon. As a young boy, he was taken, likely kidnapped, and ended up in Constantinople, where he was presented as a gift to Peter the Great. But Peter, known for his fascination with the West and love of education, saw something in the boy. Instead of treating him like a novelty, he adopted him into the royal court and sent him to France to be educated. Gannibal studied military engineering and mathematics, spoke several languages fluently, and eventually rose to the rank of general in the Russian army. By the end of his life, he was a respected nobleman with an estate of his own, commanding both soldiers and scholars. But what truly immortalized Gannibal was not his military rank, it was his bloodline. His great-grandson was none other than Alexander Pushkin, the father of modern Russian literature. Pushkin was proud of his African roots, even though he inherited just a trace of that ancestry. While many nobles tried to hide anything that could be seen as non-Russian, Pushkin leaned into it. He boasted about his lineage in letters, joked about it in poetry, and most importantly, explored it in one of his earliest literary works, The Moor of Peter the Great. In this unfinished historical novel, Pushkin set out to tell his great-grandfather's story, not just as a chronicle of a man's rise through society, but as a deeper reflection on race, identity, and the human cost of being the other in a world obsessed with appearances. The book was not just groundbreaking for Russia, it was virtually unheard of in all of European literature at the time. A black protagonist in the 1820s, written by a biracial author in the courtly language of imperial Russia. That wasn't just art. That was a quiet revolution. And then came the fear of Asia, not just of difference, but of being overtaken. By the late 19th century, racist theories from Western Europe were spreading through Russia like wildfire. Newspapers and intellectual circles eagerly consumed British, French, and German texts warning of the so-called Yellow Peril, a fear that Asia's population would one day overwhelm and dominate the West. Russia, despite being partly an Asian empire itself, absorbed this paranoia with enthusiasm. Asian people were certainly present in the Russian Empire, but mostly on its distant frontiers. They were treated like younger brothers, expected to stay on their own land and follow Moscow's orders. The average Russian peasant or city dweller had no interaction with Asians unless they were soldiers stationed in the Far East or merchants trading in border towns. This detachment bred myths and stereotypes. The few things people did know about China came through stories about food binding and gruesome executions. Caricatures depicted Chinese people with grotesque features as mysterious and menacing. But in reality, China was simply the faraway land that sent silk, tea, and porcelain. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire had taken a massive bite out of China. After the Opium Wars weakened the Qing dynasty, Russia quietly annexed vast territories in the Far East, what is now the southeastern part of the Russian Federation. Cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk were founded officially in the 19th century, but people had lived on that land for centuries. The Chinese were pushed out, the towns renamed, and the conquest quietly rewritten in history books as progress. Then Russia went to war with Japan, confident it would be a short and glorious victory. After all, Russians believed they were the superior race. Surely the Japanese couldn't match European strength. They were wrong. The Russo-Japanese War ended in humiliation. Japan's modern military crushed the Russians at sea and on land. It was a shock, not just to the Russian army, but to the national psyche. How could a lesser race defeat them? After the Bolshevik Revolution, tens of thousands of White Army refugees fled to China. Cities like Harbin and Shanghai became hubs for Russian exiles, and for the first time in history, the Whites found themselves beneath Asians on the social ladder. It was a jarring reversal. The so-called superior race was now living in poverty and dependency under foreign authority. These exiles had no choice but to adapt, rebuild, and reinvent themselves in an unfamiliar world. If you want to know what that felt like, I tell the story in detail in my novel The White Ghost's Empire. At the heart of Bolshevik ideology was a grand idealistic dream: the unification of workers and peasants around the world in a single international movement, regardless of race, nationality, or religion. In the early 20th century, this idea was radically attractive. Back then, only communists were seriously talking about the equal dignity of all people, regardless of race. The West was still deeply mired in colonialism, segregation, and white supremacy. So, yes, on paper, the Soviet Union stood for racial equality. But in practice, not quite. Moscow never intended to be an equal partner to the world's oppressed. The Bolsheviks saw themselves as the masterminds of the global revolution. The plan wasn't to build a flat system of international comradeship. It was to export the Russian version of communism everywhere and then tell everyone else what to do. From the Kremlin's point of view, people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America would gratefully break free from their capitalist overlords and promptly fall in line behind Soviet leadership. One of the earliest targets for this dream was China. By the 1920s, China had already become a key hub in global trade. The Soviets believed that if they could trigger a socialist revolution there, it would strike a devastating blow on international capitalism. This spared no expense. Moscow sent a seasoned revolutionary, Mikhail Borodin, to help organize the Chinese communists. But progress was slow. Western colonial powers and local opium tycoons had more money and influence than the Soviets could match. And crucially, the Chinese communists didn't want to be controlled from Moscow. All of this is described in my novel The White Ghost Empire. The Soviets poured money and training into dozens of revolutionary movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They recruited promising young revolutionaries from all over the world, brought them to Moscow, and trained them to lead. These foreign students were treated with curiosity and politeness, but kept at arm's length. They lived in special dorms, and only selected Soviet citizens were allowed to interact with them. In theory, the USSR was investing in a new global elite, one that would be loyal to socialist ideals. In reality, many of these movements simply replaced old regimes with new dictatorships. The Soviet-funded revolutions often ended in authoritarian rule, not freedom. Every so often, the Iron Curtain lifted, just a little. It usually happened during major international events like wars, world festivals, or global sports competitions. And 9 months later, dozens of babies of mixed race began appearing. These children were born into Russian families, carried Russian names and patronymics, but their faces sometimes told a different story. They stood out, and while life for them wasn't always easy, the reaction they got was often more curious than cruel. Take Anatoly Bavykin, for example, one of the few mixed-race children in the Soviet Union who briefly stepped into the spotlight. He was the son of a Russian mother and an American sailor who had arrived in Arkhangelsk as part of the military convoys delivering war supplies during World War II. After a short-lived romance, the sailor vanished and was never heard from again. But the woman gave birth to a boy who looked unmistakably like his father. As a teenager, Anatoly was cast in the 1950s Soviet adventure film Maximka, playing a young African boy rescued by Russian sailors from a sinking slave ship. The film was a huge success, especially among children, and like many films of that era, carried a strong anti-American message. There were also rare and remarkable cases of young black men from the United States, brilliant, highly educated, who left behind the racism of Jim Crow America and chose to stay in the Soviet Union, where they had more opportunities than they ever would have at home. The USSR, hungry for symbols of global equality, sometimes celebrated these men as proof of its moral superiority over the West. Moscow also became a refuge for exiled revolutionaries and fallen dictators from around the world. They were granted political asylum, learned Russian, and quietly settled into Soviet life. In the 1990s, as Russia opened up to the world, something darker also emerged: a spike in racist violence. Neo-Nazi skinheads roamed the streets, proudly flashing swastikas and picking fights outside the dorms where foreign students lived. Sometimes these encounters turned deadly. But even then, this aggression wasn't widespread, just loud, visible, and terrifying for those targeted. More common than violence was something else: invasive curiosity. If you were a person of color and found yourself in rural Russia, where many people had never seen anyone who didn't look like them, you could expect stares, whispers, and even people asking to touch your hair or skin just to see what it feels like. Black women in Russia often report being fetishized, hit on not as people, but as something new to try. Some men treat them like novelties rather than human beings. My Russian friend once told me how an old woman shook her head in disapproval when she saw her holding hands with her Chinese husband on the Moscow metro. "Couldn't you find a Russian man?" the woman muttered. In many people's eyes, being non-white in Russia means starting with a handicap. You can make up for it, but only if you are wealthy or exceptionally successful. A Russian woman might stick with a drinking, unemployed Russian husband, but a foreigner of the different race? He'd better be rich and impressive, or he's seen as a burden and a mistake. One friend of mine from Southeast Asia, well educated, fluent in English, married a Russian woman and moved to Moscow just before the war. He planned to work in an international company. But when the war started, those companies left. Without fluent Russian, he couldn't find a job, and his wife kicked him out. Not just because he was unemployed, but because he had become a shameful burden. Racial prejudice hasn't gone anywhere. Russians still largely identify as part of the white race. People still say things like, "you'll live like a white person," meaning comfortably, or joke, "work harder, the sun is still high," without a second thought. Movements like Black Lives Matter make little sense to most Russians. They see them as bizarre demands for apologies over slavery that ended 150 years ago. When Western police officers knelt to honor black victims, Russian media erupted in disbelief and mockery. And efforts to cast black actors in Western classics, like The Little Mermaid or historical dramas, only confuse people more. Without the social context, all they see are symbols that seem wrong. A major reason racism in Russia remains so entrenched is the legacy of the Iron Curtain. For decades, it blocked the flow of Western humanities and social thought. Most people in the former Soviet Union simply aren't aware of modern ideas about race, identity, or justice. Mentally, many are still stuck in the late 19th century, and the government does nothing to change that. After all, it shares the same outdated worldview. So things aren't as bad as they could be. But there's still a long, long way to go. If this video challenged what you thought you knew about Russia, share it. And if you want to go deeper, subscribe, join the think tank, or buy me a coffee below. This work only grows if you believe in it. Thank you for being here.